Hey guys, John Paulamy here, Actionable Intelligence. This is part of our ongoing interview series with interesting people. And today we have Scott Osheroff, a guy I've known for about 5 years. Scott I'll let him get into his story, but he's a very, in my mind, fascinating individual, interesting person, a young guy that made the move to Asia several years ago. We'll let him get into that. We wanted to have him on just because he provides a perspective. He's basically had boots on the ground all over many and several emerging and frontier markets in Asia, having lived in various countries and worked in various countries. So welcome to the show, Scott Osheroff. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, John.
What I'd like to do is just have you introduce yourself to the audience as much as you feel comfortable with, your background, where you came from, and kind of maybe how you ended up in Asia and where you are today as we're speaking in Tashkent, Uzbekistan.
Sure. So I'm an American. Grew up on the West Coast and went to university in Boston. I worked at a few investment houses in Boston and New York during uni, and realized that one of the reasons I went to the East Coast is thinking that New York was the main global financial center, which I guess technically it is, but nowadays you can work from anywhere. And working in some of the larger investment houses, realized I didn't want to work for a large firm. And then seeing that the demographic situation in the US was one where pretty much the baby boom generation had already seen that rise of wealth, which Asia is just beginning to see. And figuring I'd take a punt, I had an interest in Asian history for a long time, about a decade before university, and figured I would literally book a one-way plane ticket to Asia after I graduated in 2012 and quote unquote figure it out. I didn't look at it as being a negative coming out without anything lined up and pretty much knowing no one, because I said I'd give myself 6 months, and if I failed, I could always go back to the US. And I thought it would be a great story for an interview of saying I booked a one-way plane ticket to Asia, trying to build a life and a career. Here's why I failed and what I learned. 8.5 years later, I'm still here. Touch wood. So I'd been speaking with some people that were doing private equity investing, venture capital investing in Asia for about a year and a half before I graduated university. And lo and behold, a few weeks before I came out to Asia, we ended up working together. So I was helping source deals for them, among a few other things. And in June of 2012, I came out to Singapore, worked my way up through Southeast Asia, and then ended up in Mongolia for about 6 months. I worked with them for about a year and a half and split my time between Cambodia and Mongolia. And then I fell into working with a group called Asia Frontier Capital, which is a investment management company, which has 4 investment funds, one investing in Iraq, one investing in Vietnam, one for Central Asia and Uzbekistan, and then one for Pan-Frontier Asia. And it's listed equities only. So I started working there as a regional research analyst covering Central Asia and Mongolia and the Indochina region. So Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and a bit of Vietnam. And then during that time, I didn't actually live in Hong Kong. I had the freedom to live wherever I wanted, so it was wonderful. I spent time in Mongolia, Cambodia, a little bit of Thailand, and then I lived in Vietnam for a year and a half. And then around 2015, I sort of took on a second job. I'm very grateful that I was able to do it, but while I was still working at Asia Frontier Capital, a friend of mine in Singapore was restructuring family conglomerates in Myanmar. So Myanmar is a place that I had always thought was, an exciting frontier. Jim Rogers talks about it, of course. When I was in Mongolia in 2012, I had been there for 2 months, and this was the peak of the commodities bubble. And I remember sitting in Ulaanbaatar, and it's like someone turned off a light switch. The cranes just stopped turning, And a few weeks before, I had literally met, within 1 week, 3 people from Australia, Hong Kong, and I believe the UK. And these were investors saying, we're going to invest between $10 and $30 million into downtown real estate in Ulaanbaatar. And if you know Ulaanbaatar, if you've been, it's not a big city. There's about 1.3, 1.4 million people, and about 700,000 people live in the Ger, or sort of slum districts. To deploy that type of capital means that property prices would have to go up several 100%. And of course, after a week, they had fun, they left, and I presume that they never came back. So seeing what happened in Mongolia and knowing that Myanmar had opened up, I decided not to go to Myanmar on day one, because the way that I always looked at it is, if I wanted to go to Myanmar and build a network, hotels that had no Wi-Fi and some of them had no air conditioning were going for $150 a night. Now they go for $30. But the hype was so great. I looked at it as I would go to meet a general or a business tycoon, and I'd be his 10th meeting on a Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock, and he'd be meeting me out of courtesy. Maybe someone's going to give him a bunch of money for free. Of course, that's not going to happen, but he's willing to hear proposals. And he's probably thinking to himself, I'm taking this meeting, but really I just want to go pick up my kids and go back home and be with the family for dinner. So as that bubble began to deflate and all of that hot money began to left Myanmar, this opportunity for me opened up with my friend that was restructuring these conglomerates. And I moved to Myanmar for about 3 years. I ended up leading the restructuring of a group called Ruby Dragon, founded by a gentleman who was high up in the Pa'o ethnic minority organization or association, which controls the area around Inle Lake in Shan State. It's a gorgeous part of the country. And they also happen to be the biggest ruby miners in the world. So like any good tycoon, they had their cash cows, which were their ruby and gold mines, and they then diversified into a whole swath of assets, which got them into big trouble from a debt perspective. So my job was going in and understanding what they had, understanding what was and what was not economic, and the real value for some of these assets, and then trying to help restructure the debt, bring in investors, and ultimately try and facilitate the sale of some of them. So I did that for about 9 months, and working with these families can be a bit challenging, but nonetheless, it got me into the network in Myanmar. So again, was there for 3 years, and then I was still working with Asia Frontier Capital, of course, and I got asked if I wanted to go on an investment tour in Kazakhstan, looking at it as a new market for our regional investment fund to potentially start investing into. So I went to Kazakhstan, and relative to Mongolia, it was like New York City. The problem is that Kazakhstan is pretty much a raw material exporter. Copper, oil, a little bit of gold. Most of it's unrefined product. So there's a stock market there, but there's not much that's not heavily state influenced. But while I was in the region, I tacked on Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. And Uzbekistan blew me away. I'd been following a little bit of what had happened with the former president, Islam Karimov, having passed away in 2016, and they had liberalized the currency a little bit. They'd let it move towards a free float, and it was shocking. The infrastructure in this country is phenomenal. They have a self-financed bullet train with Spanish technology. The roads are 4 or 5 lanes in each direction. There's not a pothole in sight. All the cities are spotless. And it's a diversified economy. They have natural resources, they have agriculture, they have tourism, which is on hold at present. But it was really exciting, and more importantly, they have a stock market with about 603 companies between 2 exchanges. And just on the main Tashkent Stock Exchange, there are about 104, 105 companies, and the market cap's just south of $5 billion, which is 10% of GDP. And looking at the valuations, I was awestruck. from a PE and price to book perspective, but also the dividends. I was looking at companies with 30, 40, 50% dividends. So this was the cause that they basically gave us justification to set up a Uzbekistan / Central Asian fund under the Asia Frontier Capital umbrella. And that's sort of where I am today.
So, I mean, just in that introduction of about 8 minutes, I mean, the amount of things that you've done just in those few short years is more than most people do in their entire life. One of the things I wanted to ask you, and a couple things, but one of the first things I wanted to ask you is, you know, you've traveled to so many of these countries, you've lived in many of them, and you and I have talked offline about this. You know, what we see in the West now, the United States, Western Europe, call them the Western democracies, you know, over indebtedness, the demographics are going in the wrong direction. A multitude of problems with physical and budgetary issues in cities, states, corporations, the whole shebang. I mean, we could sit here for an hour just with a yellow pad and just list the 50 or 60 major issues. No place is perfect, but what attracts me, and I think that's how we became acquaintances through blogs or some of our emails, I don't remember. But anyways, you know, Mongolia is a perfect example. I mean, and then you mentioned Myanmar, and then having lived in Vietnam, what do you see? I mean, I think you touched on it a little bit, but I don't want to use a general statement because all these countries are different. They have some histories with each other, some animosities. But I think, and I don't want to sound talking generalities here or sound like I'm simplifying it, but Asia in particular seems to be on the rise. It goes without saying. But what do you see as a commonalities as you go through these various countries? I think you mentioned before when we were talking offline, you know, there is no social safety net in most of these countries. People do not rely or look to the government to come and kiss their life and make it better. Everywhere I've been in Asia, and I've traveled not as much as you, but everywhere I've been, and I've visited some of these countries, I see people hustling. I see people trying to make things happen. I see, you know, where was the Philippines, where I've been to, Mongolia, these other places, Thailand. I see hustle, 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 and people trying to make things happen. What's the commonalities you see? What is the, why should people be looking to Asia and get out of this, you know, home country bias that a lot of, especially Americans have?
I'd say one of them is definitely demographics. I always like to say that Asia right now is experiencing its baby boom. I mean, the baby boom has already happened, but the baby boomers are in their consumption phase. Let's say the average age in Uzbekistan, a country of 34 million people, is just under 28 years old. So these people are beginning to get married. They're buying houses, they're having children, they're buying cars, et cetera, et cetera. But what's wonderful about these countries, a lot of them, you know, they're different stages. That's what's sort of interesting, is that they're all going through the cycle, but they're all at different phases in this cycle. You know, Thailand has an older population than Vietnam, and Vietnam has an older population than, say, Cambodia and Laos. And Cambodia and Laos have a similar age, average age to Uzbekistan, but in terms of leverage in the system, Uzbekistan, having been a closed economy essentially for all of modern history, there's very little leverage here. So I'd say demographics, but as you mentioned, also the scrappiness, the fact that you ask people, do you trust your government? And it's either an immediate, you know, no, or I do, but you know, then you ask, well, you pay into some type of social insurance plan? Sure. Do you expect to get it back at some point? Very unlikely. So people are much more entrepreneurial in that regard. And there's that continuous hunger for knowledge and knowing that there's no one or nothing to fall back onto.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you in particular is that we'll do this interview and people will comment. They'll say it's very interesting and everything. And I think, I haven't found it hard to do, but I think that, when you talk about valuations and potential around demographics, obviously we just talked about that, and where the growth is going to be. People always, well, their retort will be, at least for the average person, is, well, how is this actionable? How can I, take advantage of this? And I've made the comment, well, you have to, in this age where, I mean, obviously take coronavirus out of the picture with travel restrictions, but I mean, with the internet and the ability to travel, basically you can go anywhere in the world if you're going to endure economy class for, $2,000 max, I guess. But I mean, going to these places and seeing it for yourself. I mean, I went to Mongolia and hit the ground there like you did right when the boom was going on. I mean, people were literally running around with bags of cash closing apartment deals. I know somebody that was doing that. So, I mean, it was really something to see. And when you see, cranes everywhere, activity everywhere, construction, I mean, it's something to behold. So, people getting on a plane and going to these places, you have to, I mean, being able to network a little bit. But I mean, I actually think that, putting capital into these things like in a coffee can mentality over the next 10, 15, 20 years is really going to be is probably going to lead to outsized returns relative to returns in the West. I just think it seems obvious. But that's the retort. Well, how is this actionable? I mean, there's no ETF to buy. There's nothing trading. You're not going to do this via your Schwab account. But to my mind, it is possible to take advantage of these things and with not even getting on planes and going to these places. But can you speak to that? Sometimes that seems to be a lot of the pushback. I mean, sometimes, our audience, some of the people that are on here are very sophisticated investors. They know how to do this, some are not. And I guess if you want these outsized returns, or if you want to take advantage of the possible outsized returns related to the demographics and the economic change we're seeing, you have to do a little bit of work. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know. But when you're there and you're seeing this type of investors you run into, is there a way for people that can see this and want to take advantage of it? How can they do that?
Well, I think one of the reasons that the opportunity exists is because it's hard to invest into sitting, on your couch or your desk at home. That's of course the argument for Bitcoin, is the moment that through TD Ameritrade or Interactive Brokers you can just push a button and buy crypto, it'll be much more widely adopted. So I really think the best way is to make a vacation out of it. These countries are lovely. Sri Lanka has amazing beaches. I was actually in Pakistan for an investor tour in 2016, and let's just say that when the plane was taking off from Bangkok, I was thinking, what did I get myself into? It's one of the most spectacular countries I've ever been to, and arguably, you look at the amount of serious crime in Pakistan. There are developed countries, I won't name names, but that are much more dangerous than a place like Pakistan, but it has the reputation of a country that you should never go to. But amazing scenery, amazing valuations, great culture, great food, great people. So I think people should really make a trip out of it. I mean, Vietnam has spectacular tourism infrastructure. Uzbekistan has the ancient Silk Road cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. I think it's a great way to, you don't even have to get off the beaten path. I mean, Vietnam and Cambodia have so many tourists. They're becoming sort of mainstream tourist destinations. So I'd really say just go. And once you go, you'll be able to see the opportunity and the fact that, Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi in Vietnam, they have 40, 50, 60-story tall skyscrapers. They're modern metropolises. They're not the backwaters they were, 10, 20, 30 years ago. They are the future. So yeah, I'd say get on a plane, make a trip out of it, make a vacation out of it. And then opening a brokerage account isn't hard. Firstly, there's a lot of information in these countries in English. But even if there's not, brokers have, of course, research, and they can help you get into the more liquid and bigger names. But for example, in Uzbekistan, it literally takes 5 minutes to open a brokerage account. You don't need to get your passport notarized. It's the easiest place I've ever opened up a brokerage account in my life. I'm sure in 10 years that will change, but it's very easy to do so. You just sort of need to come and do it. And I'd argue that people should actually come to these markets, one, to get an understanding of what they're potentially going to invest into, even if it's buying an apartment versus buying equities or whatnot, or putting money into a local term deposit. But if you look at some of the funds that are listed, say that there, for example, there are a few funds listed in London which allow you to invest into Vietnam. One of the challenges with those is they're usually investing into larger cap names, which might be front run by local Vietnamese investors or investors that are going direct once they're getting added to the index. So you might not be getting the best bang for your buck, and you might therefore be actually underperforming some of these local markets than if you go in and do it yourself.
So it sounds like, well, at least how I look at it too, there is a potential for some time period in the future for kind of an arbitrage, just because of the difficulty factor. Let's call it a difficulty arbitrage of, a lot of mainstream capital coming in. I mean, obviously that will happen over time, but that will probably be the time to be looking to sell for early entrants like ourselves. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, like in Uzbekistan in particular, just because you're there now, like you mentioned earlier briefly in the conversation, I mean, I was just fascinated. My wife's been there several times. She's a former Soviet citizen, so she traveled extensively, part of a dancing troupe. But she was just telling me, and I researched it myself. I mean, just like you said, they have this bullet train now, and they have this. I mean, I was just shocked that Uzbekistan, the Soviets spent a lot of time and money there. It was one of the republics where they really industrialized it, and like you said, it has a good starting base. Do they still, when I go to these former Soviet republics, at least, they still seem to have a lot of the residual, I don't want to, maybe you can explain it better, but it seems to be this, you don't see people like, bums sleeping on the street, the militia rouse them. You don't see like people, throwing trash out the windows onto the street. You come out early in the morning, you have these old ladies and stuff that are sweeping up the sidewalks. Things are kept, maybe not, they may be a little bit wear and tear on the buildings, but things are, for the most part, kept up and things are clean. Do they still have some of that remnant of that, respect for authority and legal traditions, that, the way that the Soviets kind of instilled that a little bit? Or did they throw off a lot of are they still in the Russian sphere of influence, and how much of that former influence is there? I see the same thing in Mongolia when I was there, to a certain extent, with the, I mean, not so much with the younger people, but you understand what I'm saying? Is some of that? What you're not seeing is, you're not seeing a lot of protests, movements, and things like that. You're not seeing a lot of. Most people are just focused on moving their careers ahead and moving themselves ahead, not so much getting involved in a lot of, what shall we say, wokeness, things like that.
I'd even go a step further and say they're arguably just trying to be happy and live good, fulfilling lives. Very, very much so. The Soviet-esque, nature is still there. People are relatively obedient when the government says something. For example, we were in lockdown from March 16th until, I believe, May 1st. There were no questions asked. I mean, people were not happy, of course. You can, under the previous regime, you really could not say anything bad. You couldn't criticize. This was a second North Korea. So I think you need to consider how far we've come in a few short years. But now you can criticize the government openly. You have freedom of speech. Protests, it depends on what the protest is about, but you have a large degree of freedom. So, but yes, there is still that obedience to a large degree. And to give you an example of what's happening in this country, just to get off track a little bit, is last year in May, I was in Kazakhstan for a visa run, and it was the anniversary celebrating the end of World War II, or the Russian victory. And there were protests because President Nazarbayev was basically preparing to step down and go behind the scenes and there was going to be a new president that would be elected, and there were massive protests, and a few hundred people were arrested that day. And when I was in Almaty, Telegram didn't work, WhatsApp didn't work, none of the news agencies, local or international, worked. They blocked everything. The same day, Uzbekistan unblocked 20 websites. I think some NGO websites. For some reason, the Financial Times was blocked. A lot of this was censored a long time ago, but they're basically, and Facebook and YouTube are not blocked here, but they're becoming more liberal in that regard. So it's interesting that yes, you still have that obedience and whether do that which the government says, but nonetheless, it's a evolving and developing society, which is exciting, especially when you consider that, again, really pre-2016, you didn't say anything. The country was a totally different place, and it's transformed so much. I can get into some of that if you'd like later.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's part of the, where the opportunity exists, because I don't think, when I read a lot of Western press or what neoliberal think tanks, I just read an article recently in like the Diplomat, or it was Foreign Policy, I can't remember, but it was a criticism of the current government. I think they recently had some elections or something, and it was like, well, these elections, well, of course it's not, the village, some village in Vermont or New Hampshire where everybody's, Entenmann's and coffee, and they're deciding these things. I mean, they're making a transition, basically, you said, from almost like a North Korea state, trying to manage this economic transition, this political transition. And I think part of the knock that a lot of people in the West have, which I think is stupid, is trying to pass judgment or trying to look at these things from a frame of reference from the West, which doesn't necessarily apply to the historical narrative or to the current situation in these particular countries. They have unique histories, cultures. Asian cultures are different than Western European or Northern European cultures as far as the way that they look at things. And these things are just as valid for them as we think that they are for us. And trying, I think, sometimes to import our view, which a lot of people think is, if you're a traveled person, think that our views are a little strange, into a situation like that, and then just disregarding or taking a Sharpie through, and saying I'm not going to put any money in there because it's like this, is showing a lack of understanding. So yeah, I kind of would like you to get into that a little bit, because a lot of the knock is that there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of ruling type families. I see this. I did work in Central America. It's very rampant there. Some South American countries, and where 5 or 6 families kind of dominate things. I mean, we talk about Mongolia. I think you might even know these people. I think one of the tycoons there, one of the families, they actually named their holding company Genco, which is like the olive oil company in The Godfather. I don't know if the irony was, I don't know if that was deliberate or not, but that's, I think some people look at that kind of stuff and they get the wrong view on things. Can you comment on that?
On the corruption of the family tycoon side of things, or
yeah, that just in general, or specific if you care to.
Sure. Well, firstly, being American, I'll say that when I talk with people in Asia, and especially some of the markets that I roam around in, I argue that the most corrupt country in the history of the world is the United States. And forget the fact that 100 years ago it was a free market capitalist society, increasingly not so much, but we legalized corruption. It's called lobbying. And where in some countries you might need to pay a little bit of money to, get a driver's license or whatnot, or to get a piece of paper actually reviewed rather than just having it sit on a desk for 6 months. Not that we do any of this, but it's just part of society, which locals have to endure. But America doesn't have that issue. You go to the DMV, you apply, take a test, you get your license. But if you're one of the larger corporations, you might pay hundreds of millions of dollars in lobbying fees to get something that benefits your corporation. So I think it's two different types of corruption. You could argue that over in Asia and Africa and Eastern Europe, it's sort of petty corruption. So sure, it exists, but actually this country has done a really, really good job of trying to clamp down on corruption. Does it exist? 100%. They just set up an anti-corruption agency to combat this, and I think to understand the corruption aspect, but also sort of the tycoon families in these markets, just to talk about Uzbekistan, let me give a quick brief history on Uzbekistan, what's happened since 2016. So in 2016, Islam Karimov, who was president since 1989 of the country, passed away. His prime minister, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, became president. And in December of 2016, he pretty much said, great, so we're going to keep things the way they are. And about a month later, and this is closed to the outside world, the country had very much built a economy with sort of supported by import substitution. So this country has, biscuit factories, steel production, fertilizer plants, etc. It's very much self-reliant. And he said, we're opening up to the rest of the world. We're going to transform. And part of this free market opening was to clamp down on institutional corruption and to encourage significant FDI. And arguably, no one knows for sure, but one of the reasons they potentially opened the economy is because you had millions of people that were unemployed. So structural unemployment 5 years ago was about 20 million people unofficially. And in order to not have a toppling of the government, it helps to create jobs for people and create better quality of life. So the reforms that we're seeing is encouraging FDI, which I believe last year was about $10 billion. And it's kickstarting really a whole new country. This country is only 4.5, 5 years old. So on the corruption side, one of the first things President Mirziyoyev did is he actually created a website and said, if you have any complaints about the government not being able to get, permits or this and that, or you've got issue with traffic police asking for a bribe, send it to the website. And in the first month, they got 15,000 complaints. They have an army of people addressing these things. So civil servants and people much higher up in the food chain than your low-level civil servant have been fined, fired, or jailed. And it's arguably not political. Even some of the bigwigs who've been jailed or sacked, it's very much to clean up the system. And of course, initially, when you had a structure that had been built for and had been supported for the past 20 years on a certain type of business, he was trying to change this. So of course, he made a lot of people, a lot of tycoons, and a lot of people in government unhappy. So he was unpopular in his early days. But is the economy open? As he facilitated this restructuring, the tide has sort of changed, and now there's a lot more support for him and what he's doing. And I think part of that is that the tycoons that came about under the previous president realized that they can make a lot more money in an open economy than in a closed economy. So I guess, and then to talk about your question regarding families, it really depends on the country. I mean, in Mongolia, it's controlled by, I guess, a few clans, similar to Kazakhstan, where you have a few families that control an inordinately large proportion of the economy. Very much so the same in Cambodia and in Myanmar. In Uzbekistan, there are a few big players, but they're sort of in their specific niches. One of them has the second largest grocery store chain, has a bank, has a real estate development company. But if you want to do real estate, or if you want to have a bank, or if you want to have a grocery store, you're not going to get pushed out of the market. So I think it's really a unique place. And actually, their competitor, who has the largest grocery store chain in the country, which is exactly like a Metro Cash and Carry or a Costco in the U.S. in terms of size. They just got, I believe, $40 million from the European Bank for Redevelopment to expand. So it's a relatively easy place to do business in that regard. But yes, these large families exist, but you have these in the U.S. as well, where if you're a retail operation and you had a brick and mortar location during lockdown, Amazon stole your business. So I guess it's similar in many regards, but I guess it might also be foreign to so many people. But if you look at the U.S. or Canada or Western Europe, there are certainly comparables.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think that especially if you have a lot of home country bias or you haven't traveled extensively in the rest of the world, it's easy to fall into that thinking that corruption, it's different. How I got my driver's license in Ukraine, I paid a fee to somebody that my family knew, and I never took a test. I was just given a driver's license. That's different than, like you said, spending millions of dollars on lobbyists so that you can get an advantage over your competitors, which is pretty typical here in the U.S. without a doubt. So I do agree with that. What you mentioned FDI with foreign direct investment increasing, obviously because the perception's changing and the conditions are changing that make it conducive to capital. But where's the capital coming from? Where are you seeing interest? I mean, we talk about this new Silk Road that the Chinese are doing. A lot of people hear about this. It's a former Soviet country. Do you see Russians? I mean, where is the interest coming from? Is there, I don't think people understand this. I think Uzbekistan is a landlocked country. So what do they? I mean, do they have to try to play? They have big players around them like Kazakhstan. They have China's involved, obviously, in Central Asia. They have that former Russian satellite status. What do you see around that? What's the interest? Who's coming there and doing things? Where's the money coming from?
Yeah, well, actually, it's an interesting piece of trivia. Uzbekistan is the only double landlocked country in the world besides Liechtenstein. So it's a shame they don't have access to the ocean. It would be a different country if it had. I guess not just Uzbekistan, but the way that I look at the broader region is, one of the reasons I left the U.S. is because I felt that the political arena was going to emerge sort of like a reverse pendulum, if you will, rather than slowing down, that you'd have every 4 years or every 8 years, you'd have a more radical person come to power. And unfortunately, it seems that is happening. And now you see the U.S. seeming to be more insular, at least when you're looking or watching the national news in the U.S. There's very little coverage of that which is going on in the world, which makes me think that the U.S. is going to continue to be inward looking, and perhaps Western Europe as well. So if I look at what I like to call the new Fertile Crescent, sort of from Iran, Iraq, up through Turkey, Eastern Europe, into Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, this region, I think, is so underappreciated. It has countries such as Turkey, Iran, Uzbekistan that have significant domestic manufacturing capacity. The entire region has a plethora of natural resources. In Uzbekistan, my calculations, the official reserves are not public, but talking to people on the ground in Uzbekistan, I estimate that they have 15 to 20 times their GDP of gold in the ground that they know about. And there's some significant exploration programs going on right now. And keep in mind that they only have $25 billion of external debt in a $52 billion economy, theoretically, and they have $32 billion of foreign exchange reserves, 16 billion of which is gold. So if they wanted to, they could expunge their debt tomorrow. So I think this part of the world, with its resources, installed manufacturing capacity, low debt levels, young populations, that it's going to be ripe for investment really from its neighbors. You see a lot of Turkish investment in Uzbekistan, Korean, because 3% of the population is Korean, courtesy of Stalin having actually moved some Koreans from the Kamchatka Peninsula pre-World War II. So this is sort of a melting pot of ethnicities. So you have everyone. You don't have a specific really identity for the country's people. But you have Korean, Turkish, Chinese, Russian, a little bit of Kazakh money. Some Afghan money is coming in. So really from all over. And then of course you have German and French money for some of the high-end stuff. You have Indian money, Pakistani money for the textile industry, because this is the 4th largest producer of cotton in the world. So in due course, I imagine that there will be a few thousand textile factories here, which they're working on creating the correct incentives for that to happen. So it's really quite diversified. But in terms of industries, this country has a very large petrochemical industry. Again, playing on the import substitution, actually, by the end of 2025, the government wants to ban the export of gas, mainly to China. So they're seeking investment for plastics facilities, urea, ammonia, operations for fertilizer, etc. There are few refineries here. They're pretty much self-sufficient in refined product, importing crude from Kazakhstan, and they have a little bit themselves. Textiles, since the country has so much cotton, what the government did was previously this country exported raw cotton to places like Bangladesh, who spun it into yarn and then used it in their textile production. Understanding that this country needs to be a value-added producer of materials or of goods. In 2020, the beginning of 2020, they banned the export of raw cotton. And through, I think, 2023, there's going to be a stepped increase in the export duty for spun yarn, to the point which in 2023, I think it'll be 30 odd cents per kilogram, which is presumably a disincentive for millers here to export yarn, and rather for Chinese and Turkish and Korean factory owners to relocate factories here, which of course will create a new whole set of investment opportunities, but also a new avenue for exports.
Yes, this is another thing that's really attracted me. I feel like, well, my sense is, based on my research and just the way I'm looking at things, my worldview is that we are going to be leaving the area of disinflation that we've had around the world for the last 20, 30 years. And we're going to be entering a period of, I think, inflation for various reasons, not just money printing, but just some of the receding of globalization and just like the insular looking inward of the United States and other places in, like Europe. I think there's going to be a rise of nationalism. I think you mentioned, in particular, Uzbekistan. I mean, I think that it kind of like, when you put the dominoes and line them up, I mean, they have an extensive amount of natural resources. I think they have huge uranium reserves too, something I'm really interested in. They have a developed uranium industry that I think is going to expand. You mentioned the amount of gold reserves. I mean, they talk about cotton in Uzbekistan as being white gold. So the value added mentality is what I like to hear, not just be a raw and then be, a price taker just based on whatever the current commodity prices are. So I think, that lines up also. And then with what I think is going to be a decade of probably higher commodity prices anyway and inflation, I think that this, money in a place like this is an excellent hedge against some of those things. Also, kind of gives you a lot of things that real asset type situation. Plus, you add the growth element, the demographics, the idea of going from bad to a lot less bad and possibly into good. That could cause a big revaluation. What about just like I know quite a few entrepreneurs around the world, that guys that just pick up and go places and start their own businesses. I mean, for a foreigner to come there and do that, I mean, is that, have you seen that? Have you seen guys just come up, show up and with some capital, look around, say, oh, this place needs this, and then they just, are able to do that and prosper? Have you seen any, or any anecdotes that you know of, or people that you know that have done that?
Yeah, I have a few friends that have come here and done that. A few in real estate, and real estate is about as cheap as it could get. Um, so real estate, a few that have started restaurants, one has done logistics. The one issue is from a visa standpoint, and they hopefully in due course will realize this is a great opportunity to get more dollars in the country. Is to get a visa, I believe you need to get a business visa, a multi-entry long-term visa, you need to incorporate locally, which literally takes 1 hour. I believe it's in the top 10 for doing business rankings for opening a company. Closing a company now is a different story. That takes months, but opening a company is easy. And then I believe you need to capitalize it with 200,000 US, which of course you can use, but similar to Mongolia, where if it hasn't changed, you need to put $100,000 in the company. So that's potentially the only hurdle for one to come here and start a business. But otherwise, it's quite straightforward, and it's a great place to live, good quality of life. And then, if I may, just jump back to something that you mentioned a bit earlier, is this country also has what the West doesn't have. It has positive interest rates. So right now, the central bank policy rate, I believe, is 15%. And if you put money into a local currency term deposit in the bank for a year, you can get around 22%. So the cost of capital is terribly high. And the way that I look at this country is the cost of capital comes down, and inflation's about 14%. So, but historically it was much higher, so it's coming down. And their goal by 2022 is to get inflation at 10% or below. So as more money comes into the country, the cost of capital will come down. You'll have the nascent mortgage market, which exists but is very nascent, begin to kick off, and then you'll have the same type of boom in theory as you've seen in Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and that hasn't happened yet. So it's
No, it's an excellent
pretty.
point. It's severely under leveraged, as you mentioned earlier. So, um, we're getting up close to an hour, and that's what we kind of agreed to. I kind of want to shift gears a little bit just for my own edification. I mean, I really started this journey over a decade ago when I was really looking at a lot of these places, and it was just something I fell into just based on some friendships I had, and people said, "Yeah, you should go to these places and check them out." But one of the first places I went to was Mongolia. I have this love-hate relationship with the place. I've been there a couple times. I have invested money there. What will they ever be? I mean, you would think based on, the setup there, they have a small population. Obviously, they probably have, I don't know, well into a couple $1 trillion worth of natural resources, probably haven't even, most of which haven't even been explored for yet. They're sitting right on the border with China. And it seems to be that every decision that is ever put in front of them, they make the exact opposite of the one that they should make that would allow them to have better success. Is it a place that's ever going to be able to get its act together, or have things changed? It's kind of fell off the radar screen. You mentioned it earlier. Everybody's pretty much left. You don't hear anything more about it since 2011, 2012. Or is it just going to be plagued with, stepping on its self, tripping over itself? They just do not seem to make good decisions there. And do you have any current news on that, or an opinion on that? And I would also ask you the same thing about Myanmar. I mean, I think Myanmar has tremendous opportunity also, but it really, the more I looked at it, the more people I talked to, it's really way behind on the development. That's obviously potential, but I mean, there's still like ox farming rice paddies and stuff there. So if you could kind of comment on Mongolia and Myanmar a little bit, I'd appreciate it, just for my own edification. I know there's other folks that listen to this that are also interested.
Sure, and I feel some of your pain through my personal investments in Mongolia. Again, I went there in 2012 at the top of the market, and I remember the currency was, well, I think 1,328 or around there.
Yep.
It's down 115%, or versus the US dollar. It's appreciated significantly, over the past 8 years. So it's been a difficult place to invest. I look at Mongolia, as I'm sure you do as well. It's a commodity. It's a short-term commodities trade because it's a commodities economy. They're very similar to Kazakhstan. Small population. Kazakhstan's much bigger. I think it's about 16 million, but spread out, not diversified. Exporter of raw commodities. So if you can nail the timing on a commodities super cycle, if you will, or uptrend, theoretically, there should be some great opportunities in Mongolia. The stock exchange has developed significantly from when I first went there in 2012, and you have really good consumer names as well. Bakeries, breweries. Heineken owns one of the listed breweries, or the listed brewery, but there's plenty of free float. So will it get its act together? I guess the best way to answer that is to tell you what I first realized when I came to Uzbekistan. I was in Kazakhstan for a week, and then I was in Kyrgyzstan for 3 days. And then I came to Uzbekistan, and I had this epiphany. And I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this, is that Mongolia is a nomadic society, and the moods of people, including the government, can change on a whim. And I remember when I was there in September of 2012, been there a few months, and I went into a pub with some friends, and I was wearing sandals and shorts, 6 o'clock or something. And we came out 11 or 12 o'clock at night, had dinner and whatnot, and it was snowing. And you think it was desert weather during the day, it was 40 degrees or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was snowing. And I feel that that's the mentality of the country, is that it's very volatile. If you can get the swings right, you really can get home runs. And in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, I felt that the culture was very similar. And what I realized is that these three countries are nomadic societies. Compare that to a place like Uzbekistan, which is a settled society. And as a result, you have the famous, Silk Road cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva. They built structures. So the mindset is night and day. And I think that is the way that you need to approach Mongolia, is understanding that if you can get the timing right, you have the potential to make a lot of money. But I don't know if Mongolia is a 2-decade play like South and Southeast Asia, and say, what I call this new Fertile Crescent area. Iran, Iraq, Uzbekistan. I think these places have much more longevity for your investment dollars, where you really can go in and invest some capital in the local market or buy some property. And if you do what Jim Rogers says and shut your eyes for 10 years and don't think about it, you'll probably do pretty well. So that's my take on Mongolia. Myanmar, go ahead. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think I came to that view also just from, thinking about it. Then I spent time in the southern part of the country, and I didn't live with them for a period of time, I'm not an anthropologist, but I did spend some time. I actually ran into a member of parliament that actually was a herder from one of the down by Dallin Zadgad. And I spoke with her, well, through an interpreter, and I just started realizing that that was the mentality. This is a different type of thinking. And I think that's, it's just going to be a commodity-based economy. But to your point, you have to catch the cycle, and then it's investable, and then you have to get out at the peak when everybody's running in, like you said, that that was the top. When you see all these people coming in, I'm quite familiar with the CBD in Ulaanbaatar. I mean, it's dinky. I don't know how you would get that kind of money in there, and anybody that knew that, they would see that as a bell top. But Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. It's just unfortunate though, because you see all this potential. I mean, even like you talk to even people in the government there, and it's like, do you people not realize that your major customers there, you have to build a railroad from these coal fields to the border? Well, I mean, they'll actually tell you this, some of them. Well, they could use that though if they want to invade us. Look, an airborne regiment can take the Ulaanbaatar over. They'll land at the airport. The thing it'll be over in 20 minutes. I mean, if they really want, if that was going to happen, that's how it will happen. It won't be because you have the same gauge railroad as the Chinese. So, I mean, just some of these ridiculous conversations you have with people there. But anyways, I agree 100%. It's kind of unfortunate because there is a tremendous amount of wealth in the ground there. And it's just the mentality is, I think that short term, right? They were that society lived hand to mouth as herders. You know how the winners are sometimes, and a winner can completely wipe out people's herds and things like that. So I think they have a really hand to mouth, bird in hand, not two in the bush mentality. But anyways, go on to talk about Myanmar because I'm also interested in that.
Well, last point on Mongolia is, I guess really what they'll do is they'll do something really simple if they want to bring Mongolia to its knees, and they'll just shut the border, which of course is what they did for coal when President Batuga, who's still president, decided to allow the Dalai Lama to come to Mongolia, what, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago.
That's exactly right. Yep.
So they don't even need to invade. They'll just say, no, thank you, but no, thank you. We'll buy coke and coal from Australia. Myanmar's a really exciting place. For anyone that hasn't gone, I'd suggest you definitely go and make a vacation out of it. From an investment standpoint, it depends on what you're looking to invest into. As of a few months ago, foreigners can now invest in the stock market, but buying property, it can be done, but it's tricky. It's almost too early if you're not looking to invest anywhere except the stock market. But the market has less than 10 companies. So the future of the country theoretically is bright. Geographically, it should be the transport crossroads for between Southeast Asia, South Asia, and China. And it has, sort of like Mongolia, it has the periodic table. I think one of the challenges is that, like Mongolia, like Kyrgyzstan, like India, it's a democratic country. And you speak with people in Myanmar and that had been doing business there even during the junta years, and they'll say business was far easier under the previous regime. If you wanted something, if you wanted a license for, I know a German gentleman there, he's had a factory since 2003 producing textiles. He applied for a license, he got it within a few months. He applied for a permit to get electricity offtake, he got that in short order. Things got done. The current government is a mess. And I imagine that as you look out a few election cycles, things will get easier too. It'll be an easier place to do business, but it's such a young economy. It has its challenges, but it also has its opportunities. So I guess depending on where one wants to invest in the country, it might be a situation of go now because assets have gotten quite cheap. Otherwise, it might be a situation of wait and see. But if you're looking to buy beachfront land, for example, true story, all land is owned by the government. But you can get long-term leases, and if you're a local, you can get a long-term lease, but it's perpetual. So arguably, you own the land forever. And I have a friend who, with a Burmese partner, got 30 acres of land near the Miek archipelago. So arguably, it'll become like the Phuket equivalent or even the Phu Quoc equivalent in Vietnam in 15, 20 years. And they got 30 acres of beachfront property, white sand beaches, and they're paying what's the exchange? They're paying about 70 cents per acre in rent per year. And when the time comes that the area has the infrastructure and the development, they'll be able to convert the the permission on the land to be able to build larger structures than just single-story structures, which means they're basically locking up what will become resort land or villa land for 70 cents per acre per year, and they have it indefinitely. So those types of opportunities exist in Myanmar.
That's shocking. It's $20 a year for 30 acres of beachfront property. That's basically
Correct.
what you're saying. It's crazy. But that's the kind of things that, I mean, people don't believe these things, but that's exactly the kind of the opportunities that are available sometimes. And but you're not going to, as we said earlier, that's not going to be available to you. That's not going to be something that you can get into unless you are there, boots on the ground, and you're interacting with people and making connections and stuff. So I think, I guess one of the things I really wanted to talk about on this, we've talked a lot about investment opportunities, but you're not that old, you're still not that old yourself. I'm 53. You sound like you're maybe, I don't know your exact age, around in your early 30s or around 30. But if I was a young person in the US, you graduate university, you've been put through this system, you go get yourself a suit, and you go to these interviews or internships. You're one of a million here. I mean, they just churn these people out. And so you're fighting for these, trying to say the same thing on the same interviews with, trying to get the attention in a situation that's in decline, in my view. Long-term decline. It's not going to change. And yet, if you have the gumption and initiative, you can conceivably get on a plane, pick up, go somewhere, and kind of be one of a million. You can bring a different perspective. I'm not sure, but some places I've been, it might not be so much anymore in Asia, but a lot of times when I first started going there, I mean, I'm talking about in the 80s when it was really, I mean, it was still thatch roofed house places in Thailand and stuff. I mean, it was a big deal to be from the West. People thought, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about. If you have some capital, I mean, people would just, you got to be careful. I mean, people come out of the woodwork, but I mean, I think that the opportunities there, if you want to be a pioneer, if you want to, it's not like going out West and you're going to get shot in the back with arrows physically. I mean, that can theoretically, philosophically happen to you if you're not careful, but the opportunities are just, I'm sure we could go on for hours just talking about the guy that showed up and did this and did that. I mean, I know a guy that went to, one of my business partners here is from Congo, and he said there's some guy from Massachusetts over in Kinshasa that has the largest barbecue stand in the city, and he's making millions of dollars. And him and his sister were like, what are you doing here? He goes, hey, man, there's opportunity here. So, I mean, that's the kind of things I think that if somebody, you can still make your mark in the world. I mean, people complain here, if you're waiting for somebody to come down and kiss your life or waiting for some corporate cubicle job, and that, I mean, if you're really dissatisfied with that, then I think that, your model, and you're not the only person, many people that have done this from all over the world that you talk with and interact with that have done the same thing, come to Asia. I mean, that I think is one of the things I really wanted to talk about. I mean, I guess it's just the personality of the person and whether they want to have that risk. I mean, but how much of it was a risk? You said earlier when you started out, you gave yourself a certain amount of time, and you were young enough where you said, hey, if this doesn't work out, I can always go back and do what I was doing before, or get something going in the U.S. So I mean, how would you? I mean, I guess the answer is as simple as just do it. But if somebody was interested in doing that and looking for some direction, looking for some positivity or some kind of way to get started, what would you advise them if they wanted to do something similar?
Well, assuming that the individual is one who's willing to go and be outside their comfort zone, because if you're not, it's of course a challenge. But pick a country or two that you're interested in. Definitely read up as much as you can beforehand, so you sound somewhat like an expert. And also, I think it's great to read history books, especially history books from the perspectives of people in those countries. I can get into that later, but and then pretty much show up. either book a one-way plane ticket or spend 2 weeks, but go on LinkedIn. Everyone's on LinkedIn now in these countries, and just contact people. It's amazing how many people will be willing to take a meeting with you. Or, I guess do that as phase one, but then let's say if you want to be in finance, since my background's in finance, or let's say tech, something more exciting. If you go to Vietnam, you can contact the guys that are involved in 500 startups, and there are a few tech funds there and whatnot. Contact them, and if they're not, some might be willing to meet you, but if they're not willing to meet you, then find some startups there and work your way through the ecosystem there, and then literally just organize coffee meetings or meals, and get caught up on what they're doing. Let them know that you're interested in looking around for a job. Ask if they can introduce you to anyone, and literally just, I guess, ask for introductions and run down that rabbit hole. It's what I enjoy about doing research from an investment perspective, is just running down that rabbit hole, and you never know what is going to come your way. But by running down that rabbit hole, actually, I had a friend in Singapore who I'd done some business with before, and he knew that I had an interest in Myanmar, and he introduced me to one of his friends, who happened to be the person I ended up working with in Myanmar to restructure these family conglomerates. And I literally got that gig by meeting the gentleman in Singapore for a Starbucks. And then when I was in Myanmar on an investment tour for the hedge fund, he was managing a port operation at the time. So I went to what was the biggest port, or what is the biggest port in Myanmar, popped into his office and said, it'd be great to get some exposure here if you're, it would be fun to find a way to work together. And a few weeks later, he said, by the way, there's another family that's asked us for help. Would you be interested? And it was literally just by being there and presenting myself. So I guess that's the best advice that I can give, is you said. I mean, it sounds silly to say just do it, but just show up and start meeting people. I think it's a much more dynamic place and easier part of the world to get meetings with people and potentially even get a job, than say in the US. And I can't speak too much about the US since I left a month after finishing my undergraduate degree. But I have family in the Bay Area in finance and tech, and I have asked a few times, if I want to meet with, XYZ type of people, what would be the best way to go about that? And they say, don't waste your time. It's not going to happen. So it seems that Asia is much more open doors and welcoming if you're just willing to show up and sort of grind it out and build that network.
Outstanding. So yeah, we're coming up on an hour. I appreciate the time. Appreciate getting into the detail that we got into. I think I found it interesting. I hope that a lot of the listeners did. What kind of anything that we didn't cover that you think we should cover, or that people might find useful or interesting, that we might not have discussed?
Yeah, I guess as I just mentioned about reading books and reading up on regions, my view on the world is that we're in the early stages of a seismic shift in how the global economy and geopolitics are about to function. I'd say if one is looking at investment opportunities in new parts of the world or whatnot, to try and understand how one's investments might be affected, looking out 5, 10, 15 years, I think it pays significantly to try and find literature that is written by people from these countries, so you get a different perspective. I have ties to Cambodia, and I found it fascinating 6 or so years ago when I was reading a book that I can't remember the name of, but in the West, people are taught, or we are taught, that the Pol Pot Khmer Rouge regime was terrible. The fact of the matter is that he had his headquarters in the northwest of the country near the Thai border, and of course Thailand has been a long-term ally of the United States. but the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot were financed by China and the United States. So if you read literature from people writing about that era, you realize that the Khmer Rouge was actually, this was all a proxy war in order to fight the Vietnamese. So the Khmer Rouge were producing rice and selling it to China in exchange for weapons, and the US was giving them money and weapons to be able to push back the Vietnamese. But I think it's so important that one understands history from different angles, because of course we have the saying that victors write history, but in a more or less free society globally, you have people that are able to write literature coming from different perspectives, and I wouldn't underestimate different perspectives, especially with where the world is probably headed.
No, I agree. And what's ironic is that inevitably after it was the Vietnamese that actually came into Cambodia and kind of ended the Khmer Rouge, well, militarily and politically. So that's kind of ironic. Well, we have this tendency, and a lot of people, they have biases. I've talked a lot about that in my videos. And one of the biases that I fell out of decades ago was this idea that, yes, I like the ideals of America, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to look at everything that the United States government does as being a positive, especially as we go forward, as we've seen over the last 20 years. I mean, I'm not going to get into it on this call, but just the golems that we've created, the Frankenstein monsters that we've created, that we have to go around then, and another group of politicians comes in and says that we have to kill off the golem or the Frankenstein monster that we created. Is just, well, it's tiresome for me to even talk about the stuff. Yet some people won't release themselves from these biases. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, one of the things I've tried to encourage people is you've got to create that lattice work of knowledge in your brain and take in different perspectives and views, whether or not you find them. I mean, I talk about doing that all the time, even from an investment perspective. Is like, okay, I have a certain view, shall we say, on uranium, but I'm constantly on the search for what is the bear view, what is the view that's going to get me off this thinking, not just looking for confirmation bias or looking for information that validates a view I have. And I think that most people do have that. And I think that's probably going to be a limiting factor for a lot of people to even consider going into some of these markets, even though if you look at the historical narrative from economics and investing, I mean, go back and look at, I encourage people to do this. I mean, they should actually go back and read Jim Rogers. It's a good introduction. It's kind of dated now, but some of his first books, like when he traveled the world on a motorcycle and on that specially made Mercedes, he went all over the world. And I think the first trip was in the late 80s, early 90s, and he was just going from country to country, basically checking things out, putting a few bucks in a brokerage account in each country. And I think, having that kind of perspective and then kind of understanding that things change in the world, things shift politically, economically, and we're living in one of those eras, and not understanding that. I mean, I'm getting to the midpoint of my life, but being a young person, decisions that someone makes over the next couple of years on some of these things are going to have ramifications on their future, possibly. I mean, I wouldn't be a buyer of commercial or residential real estate in a major U.S. city right now. That's probably not a good idea. And but some of the issues, I mean, things are shifting, and they're like tectonic plates, and decisions people make with their time and with their capital, and time is capital for most of us. I would exchange, if I could have the knowledge that I have now, I would exchange all of my financial capital to go rewind to 20 years old with the knowledge I have now. But of course, that's not possible, or how the things really work out. So that's kind of my goal here with some of these interviews, is to seek out people that have a different perspective and have done things such as yourself, just to give people a different perspective. I'm not knocking the U.S. I still live here. Depending on where you are in your life cycle, it's probably the right place, or it could be the wrong place. But I think your view that you articulated is is, if you're especially younger, you really need to consider where you're going to be when you're 50 years old and where the real opportunity is. So anyhow, how can people get a hold of you? Where can people follow you? I know that, I don't know if you guys still do, but AFC has these travel reports that are excellent on Seeking Alpha. A lot of times they can look on there. I don't want to force you to talk about your fund for regulatory purposes, but if people want to follow the work that you're doing or get in contact with you guys, how can they do that?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at Frontier Value H1, and if people want to contact us at the fund, they can contact me at so@asiafrontiercapital.com or go through our website.
All right, good stuff. Appreciate your time today, Scott, and hopefully we'll be talking to you some more in the near future.
Great. Thanks so much, John. Take care.
You too.